talking and show me your papers.
I am a federal judge. You have no probable cause.
A judge out here buying fruit?
Yes, and you're violating federal law.
You don't look like someone who belongs anywhere near a bench.
Everything you're doing is being recorded.
Let's go.
The farmer's market on Briarcliff Lane was the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong. White tents lined the sidewalk, bushels of stone fruit catching the early Virginia sun, the smell of fresh bread drifting between vendors who knew their customers by name. It was 9:15 on a Saturday morning, and federal judge Nadine Achebe Coleman was doing what she did almost every weekend, buying peaches. She was 54 years old, appointed to the federal bench by the President of the United States, confirmed by the Senate with bipartisan support, and had spent the last 11 years presiding over some of the most complex civil rights and constitutional cases in the Fourth Circuit. She had written opinions cited by the Supreme Court. She had been shortlisted twice for elevation to the appellate bench. Legal scholars described her as one of the sharpest judicial minds of her generation. But that Saturday morning, none of that mattered. She wasn't wearing her robe. She wasn't sitting behind the bench in her courtroom. She was wearing a linen blouse, sunglasses pushed up on her head, a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder, standing in front of a fruit stand and squeezing peaches to check for ripeness, the way her mother had taught her decades ago. She was relaxed. She was unguarded. She was smiling at the vendor, making small talk about the weather and whether the white peaches were better this year than last. She had no idea that 40 feet away, parked in an unmarked black SUV with tinted windows on the opposite side of the street, 2 ICE agents were watching her, and they had already decided, before she had spoken a single word, before she had done a single thing wrong, that she did not belong there. The man behind the wheel of the SUV was Bryce Kessler, 42 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. His supervisors called him aggressive but effective. His colleagues called him old school, the same dangerous euphemism that always meant the same thing. The communities he patrolled had a different word for him entirely. Kessler had built his career on what the agency internally referred to as street pickups, approaching individuals in public spaces, demanding documentation, and detaining anyone who hesitated or couldn't immediately prove their immigration status. On paper, it looked like proactive enforcement. In practice, it was racial profiling so consistent it could have been a written policy. 7 formal complaints had been filed against Kessler over the past 5 years. Every single one from Black or Latino individuals who had been stopped in affluent neighborhoods, questioned without cause, and in several cases, detained for hours before being released without charges. Every single complaint had been reviewed by Internal Affairs. Every single one had been dismissed. Kessler had learned the same lesson that every officer like him eventually learned, that as long as nobody important was watching, the system would protect him. His partner that morning was Dominic Peretti, 36, 5 years on the job, and the kind of agent who had long ago stopped thinking for himself. Peretti had never once questioned one of Kessler's stops, never filed a dissenting report, never raised a concern about the pattern that was obvious to anyone paying attention. They were supposedly running a routine sweep that morning, looking for an undocumented male suspect connected to a workplace visa violation 3 counties away. The suspect was described as male, mid-20s, 5'7". Nadine Achebe Coleman was female, 54 years old, 5'9", and alone at a farmer's market buying fruit. She matched nothing on any warrant, nothing in any database, nothing on any bulletin. But Kessler watched her anyway, because in his mind, a black woman in an upscale Virginia neighborhood was reason enough. Kessler opened the driver's side door and stepped out onto the pavement with the kind of deliberate, unhurried confidence that came from years of knowing nobody had ever held him accountable for anything. Peretti followed a half-step behind, falling into formation the way he always did, the way he had been doing since his first week partnered with Kessler. They crossed the street without urgency, weaving between the white tents and morning shoppers, their eyes locked on Nadine the entire time. She didn't notice them until they were less than 10 feet away. Kessler spoke first, his voice carrying the flat, commanding tone of a man who expected immediate compliance and had no patience for anything less. He told her he needed to see identification. Nadine looked up from the peaches she was holding, her expression shifting from surprise to something more measured, more careful. She asked why. It was a simple question, a reasonable question, a question any citizen had the right to ask when approached by law enforcement without warning or explanation. Kessler told her they were conducting an immigration enforcement action in the area and that she needed to verify her status. The words landed in the warm morning air like something heavy and wrong. Nadine set the peaches down slowly, her hands steady, her voice calm and clear as she stated that she was a United States citizen and asked what probable cause they had for approaching her. While she spoke, Peretti moved silently to her left, positioning himself between Nadine and the open walkway behind her, cutting off the path she would have taken to leave. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. She wasn't being questioned. She was being boxed in. Goldie Hartwell, the 71-year-old woman who ran the peach stand and had known Nadine as a Saturday morning regular for over 3 years, stood frozen behind her table, her weathered hands still resting on a crate of fruit, her eyes wide with confusion and the beginnings of fear. Other shoppers had started to notice. A couple pushing a stroller slowed. A man carrying a bag of tomatoes stopped mid-step. The atmosphere at the market was shifting, the easy Saturday warmth giving way to something tense and electric. Kessler's expression changed the moment Nadine asked about probable cause. His jaw tightened, his posture squared. He was not accustomed to being questioned, and he was especially not accustomed to being questioned by a black woman who spoke with the kind of authority that made his own sound small. Nadine told them clearly and without hesitation that she was under no legal obligation to produce immigration documents, that she was a natural-born United States citizen, and that she was a sitting federal judge. She said the words calmly but firmly, enunciating every syllable with the precision of someone who had spent over a decade choosing her words from the bench and understood exactly how much weight they carried. For a moment, the air between them seemed to hold still. Then Kessler laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncertain laugh, an open, dismissive laugh that carried across the market stalls and made at least 3 nearby shoppers turn their heads. He looked at Peretti and said loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear, "They all say something like that." The contempt in his voice was total. The assumption behind it was clear. In Kessler's world, a black woman claiming to be a federal judge wasn't stating a verifiable fact. She was running a con. He accused her of being evasive, of refusing to cooperate with a lawful immigration action, and ordered her to place her hands flat on the wooden table of the produce stand. Nadine did not move. She repeated, with the same steady control that had commanded courtrooms and silenced hostile attorneys, that she was a sitting United States federal judge, that her judicial credentials were in her vehicle 30 feet away, and that they were making a very serious mistake. She warned them that every second they continued was compounding the legal consequences they would face. Kessler didn't hesitate. His hand shot forward, gripping Nadine's left arm just above the elbow, and in one brutal motion, he twisted it behind her back with enough force to send a jolt of pain through her shoulder. Her body pitched forward into the table, sending peaches rolling off the edge and scattering across the pavement in every direction. Goldie Hartwell screamed, her hands flying to her mouth, her voice cutting through the morning like a siren. Shoppers froze. A mother pulled her child behind her, and 15 feet away, retired Marine Colonel Warren Osei, 67, a decorated veteran who had served 3 combat tours and recognized injustice the way only someone who had fought for this country could, raised his phone and began recording. His hands were steady. His angle was clear. Kessler's body camera was already rolling, the red light blinking on his chest, capturing every frame of what he was doing from his own perspective. So was Peretti's. 3 recordings, 3 angles, every second of what came next preserved in a clarity that no lie, no report, no internal investigation would ever be able to erase. Kessler drove Nadine forward and down onto the folding table with both hands. The legs buckled instantly. Nadine hit the asphalt hard, her sunglasses flying off and shattering on the pavement. Peaches crushed beneath the collapsed table inches from her face. Her left wrist, already twisted, wrenched at an angle that sent pain radiating from her fingers to her shoulder. Before she could take a full breath, Peretti was on her, pulling her arms together and cinching a plastic zip tie around both wrists with mechanical efficiency. Kessler stepped back and keyed his radio, his voice flat and professional, completely detached from the violence he had just committed. He reported a non-compliant subject resisting an immigration hold and requested transport to the field processing facility. Every word was a lie. Nadine had not resisted. She had answered every question. She had repeatedly offered to provide identification that would have resolved the entire encounter in seconds. But Kessler's radio call was already building the false record designed to justify everything he had done. Nadine lay on the ground, her cheek pressed to warm asphalt, her voice shaking but controlled with a discipline forged across decades on the bench. She stated her full name, her title, her court. She told them her judicial credentials were in her car 30 feet away. Kessler looked down at her and said 5 words his body camera captured with perfect clarity. "We'll sort that out at the facility." Around them, at least 7 people had their phones raised and recording. A woman near the bread vendor was crying, her 2 young children pressed against her legs. Colonel Osei moved closer, hand steady, capturing everything in frame. And Nadine Achebe Coleman, a federal judge confirmed by the United States Senate, lay face down on a sidewalk in zip ties because a man with a badge had decided her skin color was probable cause. Goldie Hartwell broke first. The 71-year-old vendor stepped out from behind her collapsed table, voice trembling with fury, shouting that she knew this woman, that her name was Nadine, that she was a judge, that she came every Saturday, and that what they were doing was criminal. Kessler didn't look at her. He told her to step back and stay out of official business. From across the market, Reverend Solomon Niathi, 63, senior pastor of Grace Covenant Church, moved through the crowd with quiet authority. He identified himself and told Kessler he was making a grave error. He urged him to verify her identity before taking her anywhere. Kessler's response was immediate. He told the Reverend to back off or face obstruction charges. Then came another voice, sharp and certain, cutting through the noise from the edge of the crowd. "That's Judge Achebe Coleman. She sits on the 4th Circuit. I attended her lecture at Georgetown last semester. That is a federal judge." Inez Carrillo, 24, a second-year law student, was pointing directly at Nadine's face, still pressed against the asphalt, her voice carrying with the force of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. For the first time, Kessler hesitated. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, but the faintest recognition that the ground beneath him might be shifting. Peretti pulled him aside, just far enough to lower their voices, but not far enough to escape the microphones on their own body cameras, which captured every word with devastating clarity. Peretti asked what they should do. Kessler's answer was quiet but absolute. "Doesn't matter. We finish what we start. She can prove it at processing." 14 words that would become the most replayed audio in the entire case. 14 words that proved this was never about enforcement or the law. It was about control, ego, and 2 men who believed their badges made them untouchable. Nadine was placed in the back of the unmarked SUV without a seatbelt. Her wrists were still zip-tied behind her back, the plastic cutting into skin that was already swelling and bruised. The door closed and the vehicle pulled away from the farmer's market, leaving behind a crowd of stunned witnesses, a destroyed produce stand, and crushed peaches drying on hot pavement. The drive to the ice field processing facility took 40 minutes. Nadine didn't speak a single word the entire time. She sat upright, staring straight ahead, her face unreadable. But behind that silence, a mind that had spent 11 years dissecting constitutional law from the federal bench was already working. She was cataloging every violation, every unlawful act, every word that had been spoken, every second of force that had no legal justification. She was building a case, and she hadn't even arrived at the facility yet. Kessler and Peretti, meanwhile, talked freely in the front seats, unaware or unconcerned that Kessler's body camera was still recording. The audio captured Kessler's voice clearly as he glanced in the rearview mirror and said, "A federal judge buying fruit, sure, sweetheart." Peretti laughed. The sound was casual, easy, the laughter of a man who had spent 5 years treating cruelty as routine. At the facility, Nadine was processed like any other detainee. She was photographed. Her personal items were confiscated: her tote bag, her wallet, her phone, her car keys. She was escorted to a holding cell and placed inside with 3 other detained women who looked at her torn blouse and zip tie marks with recognition and exhaustion. A federal judge, appointed by the president, confirmed by the United States Senate, was sitting on a metal bench in an immigration detention cell, and the 2 men who put her there still thought they had done nothing wrong. 90 minutes passed before Nadine was allowed a phone call. 90 minutes of sitting on a metal bench under fluorescent lights in a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. When they finally handed her a phone, she dialed one number. Her husband, retired Army Brigadier General Tobias Coleman, answered on the second ring. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. Her voice was steady. She told him where she was, what had happened, and what she needed him to do. Tobias Coleman had commanded soldiers in combat zones and had coordinated operations that involved heads of state. Within 3 minutes of hanging up, he was on the phone with Judge Ramona Forsyth, Chief Judge of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and Nadine's direct superior in the federal judiciary. Forsyth listened in silence for exactly 45 seconds before saying 4 words. "I'm calling the DOJ." Within 20 minutes, a chain of phone calls was moving through the highest levels of the federal government with a speed that only happens when the system realizes it has turned on one of its own. The Department of Justice contacted ICE headquarters. ICE headquarters contacted the regional field office. The regional field office contacted the processing facility. A senior supervisor named Arthur Devane was sitting at his desk when his phone rang with a call from a number he had never seen before. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the color had drained completely from his face. He stood, walked down the corridor to the holding cells, looked through the reinforced glass window, and saw a woman in a torn linen blouse with red marks on her wrists sitting on a metal bench among immigration detainees. A federal judge. In his facility. Processed by his agents. And the full, catastrophic weight of what had happened hit him all at once, like a freight train with no brakes. Nadine Achebe Coleman walked out of ICE custody after 2 hours and 47 minutes. Supervisor Arthur Devane personally cut the zip ties from her wrists, offered water, offered medical attention, and began apologizing with the desperate urgency of a man who understood his career was now tied to the worst decision 2 agents under his authority had ever made. Nadine accepted the water. She declined everything else. She said nothing about the pain in her wrist or the scrape on her cheek or the humiliation of being photographed and processed like a criminal in a facility she could have shut down with a single ruling from her bench. She made only 2 requests: that all body camera footage from both agents be preserved immediately and without alteration, and that she be given the full legal names and badge numbers of every agent involved in her detention. Then she walked out. Tobias Coleman was standing in the parking lot beside a black sedan. Next to him were 2 attorneys from one of Washington's most respected civil rights firms and a former federal prosecutor who had spent 18 years putting corrupt law enforcement officers in prison. They saw Nadine before she saw them. The torn blouse, the bruised wrists already darkening to purple, the raw scrape across her right cheekbone where her face had met the asphalt of a farmer's market sidewalk. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Photos were taken immediately, clinical and thorough, documenting every mark on her body. Medical examination began within the hour at a private facility where a physician cataloged her injuries with the precision of someone who understood the photographs would eventually be projected on a courtroom screen. By that evening, every major news outlet in the country was running the story. By midnight, the footage Colonel Osei had recorded at the farmer's market had been viewed over 4 million times, and it was only Saturday. Federal investigators arrived within 48 hours. Teams from the DHS Office of Inspector General and the DOJ Civil Rights Division descended on the field office with the kind of coordinated intensity that only came when the government understood it was investigating itself. Body camera footage from both Kessler and Peretti was pulled, duplicated, and reviewed frame by frame in a secure room where every pause, every rewind, every sharp intake of breath from the investigators watching told the same story. The footage was devastating. Colonel Osei's phone recording was collected and synchronized with the body cam angles, creating a three-perspective reconstruction that left no moment unaccounted for and no lie survivable. Witness statements were taken from 14 people who had been at the farmers market that morning, and their accounts were consistent with a uniformity that only happens when every person is simply describing the same undeniable truth. But the investigation didn't stop at the farmers market. When investigators pulled Kessler's complete service record, what they found was a pattern so clear and so damning it should have ended his career years before he ever laid hands on Nadine Achebe Coleman. Over 60 stops in affluent neighborhoods across 4 years, the overwhelming majority targeting Black and Latino individuals. In 23 of those stops, the subjects were United States citizens with no immigration issues of any kind. People detained, questioned, humiliated, and released without apology because the color of their skin had been treated as reasonable suspicion. Internal emails recovered during discovery showed that supervisors were not only aware of Kessler's methods, but had actively endorsed them, describing his approach as proactive enforcement, in language that treated racial profiling as a job well done. Peretti's records completed the picture. He had been present for the majority of those stops. He had never filed a single objection. And on 11 separate occasions that later resulted in formal complaints, his body camera had mysteriously not been activated. The pattern wasn't a coincidence. It was a partnership built on silence, complicity, and the shared belief that no one would ever care enough to look. The federal grand jury returned its indictments 6 weeks after the incident, and the charges landed like a bomb across every level of federal law enforcement. Bryce Kessler was indicted on deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, assault, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Each charge carried the weight of years in federal prison. Dominic Peretti was indicted on conspiracy, failure to intervene in an unlawful use of force, and filing a false report. That last charge was particularly damning because the processing paperwork Peretti had completed at the facility described Nadine Achebe Coleman, a sitting federal judge with 11 years on the bench, as uncooperative, no valid ID, possible undocumented. Every word on that form was a fabrication, and Peretti had signed his name to it. 2 supervisors at the field office were also charged with conspiracy for enabling years of racially targeted enforcement, for reading the complaints and the internal reports and the emails describing Kessler's methods as proactive enforcement, and choosing to do nothing except let him keep going. The indictment sent shockwaves through the agency. ICE headquarters issued a carefully worded public statement, distancing itself from the agents, calling their actions inconsistent with the values of the organization. Language so hollow that even sympathetic commentators called it insulting. More telling was what happened with the union. Federal law enforcement unions almost always defended their members, almost always provided legal representation, almost always circled the wagons regardless of what the evidence showed. But after the body cam audio leaked publicly, after the country heard Kessler's voice saying a federal judge buying fruit, "Sure, sweetheart," after millions of people listened to him tell Peretti, they all say something like that, the union quietly declined to represent him. When even the people whose job it was to protect you decided you were too toxic to stand beside, the verdict was already written. The trial was just a formality. The criminal trial lasted 4 weeks, and from the first hour of the first day, it was clear there would be only one outcome. Prosecutors opened by playing the body camera footage from both agents simultaneously on split screens mounted in the courtroom. The jury watched Kessler approach Nadine at the peach stand. They watched him grab her arm. They watched him drive her into the table. They heard the legs collapse. They heard her hit the ground. They watched Peretti zip-tie her wrists while she lay face down on the pavement, stating her name, her title, and her court. Then prosecutors played the audio from the SUV. The courtroom was silent as Kessler's voice filled the room. A federal judge buying fruit. "Sure, sweetheart." And then Peretti's laugh. Colonel Osai took the stand and his phone footage was played alongside the body cam angles, creating a synchronized three-perspective reconstruction that left the jury watching the same assault from every direction, with no place for their eyes to escape what had happened. Goldie Hartwell testified she had told both agents repeatedly that Nadine was a judge and a regular customer who came every Saturday. Inez Carrillo testified she had identified Nadine by full name and court from the edge of the crowd. Expert witnesses testified that no probable cause existed, that no active warrant matched Nadine's description, and that the agents had no lawful authority to detain her under any statute. Then Kessler took the stand. His attorney put him there believing he could project the calm professionalism of a veteran agent following procedure. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Under cross-examination, Kessler could not name the suspect he had supposedly been looking for that morning. He could not explain why he had targeted a 54-year-old woman when the bulletin described a male in his mid-20s. He could not justify the force used against a cooperative subject. He stumbled. He contradicted his own report. He contradicted the body cam footage playing on the screen behind him. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Guilty on all counts for Kessler. Guilty on all counts for Peretti. Neither man showed emotion as the verdicts were read, but Kessler's hands were shaking. The sentencing hearing was standing room only. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. Federal officials sat in the front row. And when Judge Nadine Achebe Coleman stood to read her victim impact statement, the courtroom went so quiet you could hear the scratch of the court reporter's keys. She spoke for 7 minutes. She described what it felt like to be thrown face first onto pavement by agents of the same government she had sworn an oath to serve. She described the sound of the zip tie clicking tight around her wrists. She described Kessler's voice in the SUV, the casual cruelty of a man who found her dignity amusing. She described the holding cell, the metal bench, the fluorescent lights, the silence of 3 other women who looked at her bruises and said nothing because they had learned that speaking changed nothing. She described coming home that evening and watching her 2 adult children see the scrape on her face and the purple bruises circling her wrists. She described her daughter's expression, the shock, the anger, the grief of realizing that her mother's robe and title and lifetime of service could not protect her from the thing they had always feared. Then Nadine looked directly at Kessler and spoke the words that would be quoted in every newspaper in the country the following morning. "I have spent my career upholding the Constitution. That morning, 2 men in badges decided the Constitution did not apply to me because of the color of my skin." The judge presiding over the sentencing held nothing back. He called Kessler's actions a stain on every officer who serves honorably, and a betrayal of the oath that should mean something. Kessler was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Peretti received 4. The 2 supervisors who had enabled years of racially targeted enforcement received 2 and 3 years respectively. Kessler's law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He would never carry a badge again. The civil suit was filed in federal court against Kessler, Peretti, both supervisors, the field office, and the Department of Homeland Security itself. Nadine's legal team laid out the full scope of what had been done to her with the kind of meticulous, devastating precision that left no corner of the agency untouched. Physical assault, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, racial profiling, systemic failure of oversight, reputational harm to a sitting member of the federal judiciary. Each claim was supported by body camera footage, witness testimony, medical records, and the processing paperwork that Peretti had signed, describing a federal judge as possible undocumented. But it was discovery that delivered the final blow. Internal DHS memos recovered during the process revealed that senior officials had acknowledged what they called overly aggressive field tactics in the region, more than 2 years before Kessler ever touched Nadine at that farmer's market. The memos documented complaints. They referenced patterns. They recommended review. And then, nothing happened. No corrective action was taken. No retraining was ordered. No agents were reassigned. The system saw the problem, wrote it down, filed it away, and allowed it to continue until it destroyed a woman's Saturday morning and her faith that the government she served would treat her as a citizen. The case settled for $32 million, one of the largest individual civil rights settlements in federal law enforcement history. But the money was only part of it. The settlement mandated sweeping structural reforms across ICE field operations, mandatory documented probable cause before any street stop, independent civilian oversight with real investigative authority, real-time body camera review protocols with consequences for non-compliance, and the creation of a rapid verification system allowing individuals who claimed government credentials during enforcement encounters to be confirmed on the spot before any detention could proceed. $32 million and a blueprint for making sure no one would ever have to prove they were a federal judge from the back of a holding cell again. Nadine Achebe Coleman returned to the federal bench on a Monday morning 6 months later. When she walked into her courtroom, every person in the gallery rose. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. She said nothing. She sat down, opened the first case file, and went back to work. She used a portion of her settlement to establish the Coleman Achebe Justice Initiative, a foundation providing free legal defense to victims of unlawful immigration enforcement who didn't have a title or attorneys waiting in a parking lot. People who were zip-tied and never made the news. People who disappeared into facilities and had no voice loud enough to make the system care. Colonel Osei's footage became part of mandatory federal training materials distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Every new ICE agent would watch that video during orientation and be told the 2 men who did it were serving federal sentences. Goldie Hartwell returned to her stand with a hand-painted sign, "All are welcome here." Kessler served his sentence in a federal facility where his former profession made him a permanent target. He never apologized. He never acknowledged wrongdoing. He maintained until the end that the system had turned on him for political reasons. Peretti wrote a letter to Nadine from prison. She received it. She never opened it. The following summer, on a Saturday morning almost exactly 1 year later, Nadine walked through the same farmer's market on Briarcliff Lane. Linen blouse, sunglasses, canvas tote. She stopped at Goldie's stand, squeezed the peaches the way her mother taught her, and bought a bag. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned whether she belonged. For every case like this where power, evidence, and courage converge, there are thousands where they don't. But each one that ends in accountability makes the next one harder to ignore. And somewhere in Virginia, a federal judge is buying peaches on a Saturday morning. Uninterrupted. The way it always should have been. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.